Good morning, friends. Welcome back to Heartscapes. We're provisioning for the journey home to ourselves at the intersection of self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. And if that sounds intriguing to you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, and I appreciate all of your interactions here. Most often when we're talking about provisioning for the journey home to ourselves, I am working with the foundation of the precepts of the system of Reiki that we teach and practice here. For example, the provision of deep self-compassion and compassion for others. The provision of being able to make decisions and move through our life, being true to our way in our being grateful, experiencing that medicine of gratitude, and being able to move through life unattached to our anger, to our fear, to our sadness, to allow those things to inform us, to bring forward our humanity without becoming attached and identified with them. But you might also notice that there is a playlist on this channel called In the Garden. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, because, gardening is the hobby, the activity, the work that I get to do that's a little bit outside of the job that I do. But it's also because, aside from my children, the garden is my greatest teacher when it comes to understanding how we collaborate with the world, collaborate with the cycles of life in order to build those provisions that I'm speaking of, and ultimately to be resilient to what life throws at us, resilient and joyful. And so as I'm sitting out here in the garden this morning, the bees buzzing behind me, the chickens clucking, doing their morning business, watering the yard, I just thought I would take you along with me and just share a little bit of my story of how I came to the garden, what the garden teaches me, what the garden provisions me with, both in the material sense, food, beauty, flowers, shade, sitting under this shady arbor, and also in the spiritual sense, the provisions that tending and being tended by a living space brings to us. So yeah, I'd love to take you along. So I invite you to grab some coffee or some tea and maybe a journal, because I'm going to invite you to reflect yourself on why it is that you come to the garden. That might be because you yourself tend a garden. It might be because sometimes you're just called to walk or sit in a garden. Maybe you've never really thought about why that is. Or perhaps it's more an internal garden. Why do you come to the living spaces inside of yourself? So let's sit with those questions. Let's take a look around this garden and tell some stories. Thanks for being with me. Folks, will you look at these absolutely gorgeous, tiny little roses? This was a Mother's Day gift to myself. Just an inexpensive little rose bush I grabbed at the grocery store, popped it in a pot, and it's just doing so well. These little candy cane striped roses, they just bring me joy. So my story with the garden began on September 11th, 2001. I was 24 years old, was just starting to take some college classes, and on that fateful day, September 11th, 2001, as was the case for many of us, I felt my world kind of come crashing in as the terrorist attacks in New York changed my perspective about everything from my own personal safety to the experience of myself as an American in the world. And as the events unfolded from there and the war in Iraq began and Afghanistan, I became kind of radicalized very, very quickly politically, and it just began a very intense and really like worldview shattering time of my life. And in the immediate aftermath of those attacks, when I felt more vulnerable and small and out of control than I ever had in my life. I desperately needed to engage with something that I felt like I could control in some way. And so I first came to the garden for control. I felt like I have a little plot of land here at this apartment that I live in with my then husband and daughter, and I can put some seeds in the ground. I can water them. I can grow something lovely and something valuable, something that can contribute, that can provision my family, and I can have control over that in this one little postage stamp plot of land. And so that was my first introduction to gardening. It was truly out of the need in terms of my own mental health to feel like there was something I could hold and observe and that could follow a predictable cycle. If you put a seed in the ground and you water it and you give it the space it needs, it's going to grow something, because that's what a seed wants to do. It wants to bring forward life. And little did I know at the time, but it really, in many ways, changed the trajectory of my life, because what started as something very private, me and my family growing some food in our apartment, pretty quickly became almost like a purpose, like a mission. My ex-husband and I got very involved in community gardening and sustainable food growing efforts in the Bay Area region where we lived in California, and ultimately in larger sustainability efforts related to solar energy and other things. And we kind of found this identity and this purpose around sustainability, around growing communities, growing families, growing our own hearts in a way that fed back into the cycle of life rather than simply extracting, all the time extracting. And that remains one of my core values. It remains one of the things that's most deeply important to me, and that gets incorporated into everything I do. And so that first moment of coming to the garden because I needed some little piece of my life that I could control really ended up informing and revealing to me something about who I am deeper inside and what really matters to me, what my core values are. And I'm standing here in this tiny little archway, some cucumbers growing on this side, some melons growing on this side, and just, reflecting back on that time of that need for control and for containment, really, like to be held by something, and just really feeling that in my body as I'm encircled by these plants here. And speaking of this trellis, look at this absolutely adorable little baby Kajari melon growing here on this trellis. Trying this variety for the first time. It will mature to a beautiful orange and green striped melon from the Punjab province of India. The Kajari melon, such a lovely little muskmelon friend. Grow well, baby. So this next part of the story, I wanted to tell you here by some container gardens. There's a Black Beauty tomato here growing in this pot against this trellis, and some raspberries in containers. And there's a number of containers just around this corner here. I'm on my patio garden, which is primarily raised beds because it's on concrete with a little bit of a in-ground strip on the side. So this is my container garden. And the second part of my story of how and why I came to the garden really has to do with containment. We gardened that plot of land around that apartment for almost 12 years. And it was a corner apartment with all kinds of strange little like areas that had bushes and such that hadn't been touched for years. And we, in that time, kind of took over every possible space for growing food and turned this, funky old little apartment in an area of the city that had barely any trees at all, and just turned it into a lush food garden. And it was, our pride and joy. And then we decided to move to Davis, to the Central Valley of California. And of course, it went without saying that we would start a garden here. And for me, upheaving my family and my life and leaving everything that I had ever known behind, wasn't that far away, about an hour, 20 minutes away, but very different climate, a very different region, a different kind of community, and an hour and a half away from my family and friends. And I knew that what I would need in order to settle was some form of care and containment. And so that's what the garden became for me at that point. We got a plot at our local community garden, and also started working with the garden space at our house, which was very shady, very neglected, lots of these craggy old bushes that had to get taken out. It was definitely a piece of work to get anything to grow at the site where we were living. And so we did rent a community garden plot, which is very close to us. And it became about creating a sense of care and containment. Something not only that we could care for here in this new place, but that could care for us as well. And speaking just for myself, I really, really shifted this feeling of like I'm in control of the garden, right? So I originally came to it for control, to the garden is caring for me. The garden is creating a container of care as I make this major life transition. And it can be something that that can kind of hold me in this time of transition, in part because of the predictability of the cycles of it, right? I know the cycles of this particular expression of my life, and I can rest into that even as everything around me is changing. And I really needed that at the time. However, that's not what I received, because Davis is a very different region than the Bay Area. And all of a sudden, my predictable experience of control of the garden was sent completely out of whack, because I found that I did not know how to garden here in the Central Valley. And that began the third phase of my story of how I came to the garden, which had a lot to do with failure. I'm just flipping the camera around from where I am here in the container garden. Just wanted to show you this view of these huckleberries. I'm growing huckleberries for the first time, and they are doing really well. You can see the little clusters of berries there. They'll ripen to black, and they don't taste like much until you cook them up in a pie or some jam, and then they become really rich and delicious. And they're doing pretty well out here in the container garden, and they just look so lovely sunbathed here. I wanted to share it with you. So I wanted to start this chapter in this little corner of the container garden. You can see this pot here with this very wilty looking pumpkin getting a little yellowed. And that space behind the pumpkin, up until yesterday, was filled with 2 cherry tomato plants that were absolutely miserable here in this spot. Diseased, just, the berries that the tomatoes they were ripening were just not even tasty at all. They were just doing awful and taking a lot of resources from this poor pumpkin here. So I just ripped them out yesterday and chalked that up to a garden failure. And that is the chapter that we're on now. Ooh, I had to get out of that direct sun to keep talking to you. I always want to get up super early and make these videos in the morning when the light is that, golden hour, beautiful light, and it's not so intense out here, but it doesn't usually happen. So here we are, the brightness of the sun. So I did not know that um, that I came to the garden to learn about failure. But nevertheless, that was one of the most important lessons that the garden needed to teach me. When I first moved here and we started gardening, we learned really quickly that the climate of the Central Valley, very hot, very dry, is quite different than the climate of the Bay Area, which has generally cool and foggy summers. And I could not figure out the formula for keeping plants alive here in this region. I could see that it was possible because there were plenty of other gardeners around me doing just fine, but I could not seem to do it. And after a couple of years of my gardens dying and frizzling out, while in the midst of other areas of my life where I was experiencing failure, experiencing parenting failure, experiencing marriage failure, experiencing some job failure. It was like in this season of my life, there were just every important aspect of my life, it seemed, was in some form of no longer working the way that it always had for me. And when I came to the garden for care and containment and then experienced failure, one failure after the next, frankly, I just was not resilient to it. I couldn't handle it. It was devastating that this place that had always been a place of care and containment and a place where I could plug myself back into the natural cycles of the earth that I felt so dissociated from in my life, all of a sudden was requiring effort that I just didn't seem to have. It was requiring knowledge and skills that I just didn't seem to have. And I felt defeated by it. And rather than approaching that defeat from a place of resilience, a place of curiosity, a place of tenacity, seeing that there were clearly solutions to these problems because other people were solving them, rather than taking that stance, I just walked away. I stopped gardening altogether for years. I let my backyard become a weedy mess. I turned it over to my chickens once I got chickens and let them turn it into a mess. I just walked away. And as the, just the episodes of my life unfolded from there over the years, I kind of forgot about what the garden had meant to me. It seems like I had just been willing or perhaps defeated into letting that chapter of my life close. And, in the busyness of life, I didn't even necessarily notice. I didn't necessarily grieve for it at that time. But the grief was there nonetheless. And also the learning about failure was there nonetheless. And a number of years later, in the midst of another time of profound change and transition in my life, when I found myself single parenting, when I found myself facing job transition, beginning to contemplate this crazy notion of starting my own business, which would become Heartscapes, I found myself again turning back to the garden. I found myself turning back to the garden, first of all, from a place of almost apology, like, gosh, I'm sorry I left you. I love you. Will you please be with me again? And I started small. I had long since let that community garden plot go, so I didn't have that anymore. But I chose one small patch in my backyard, the one that got the best sun. And I hauled some rocks back there and created a spiral herb garden. And I took very good care to bring in the best compost that I could so the soil was refreshed after being neglected. I mulched it really well. I researched herbs that did well in this region. I committed to daily watering, which really is necessary out here in the Central Valley. That was a point of stubbornness that contributed to my failure. I was like, I don't really have to water this garden every day, do I? Yeah, you do. Um, and I grew some herbs. That little tiny herb garden became my first my first garden success. We did have our first year at the community garden. We did grow a boatload of butternut squash. For some reason, that did really, really well. So that was a success. But then it was after that that things became bad. So this was my first success on my own here in this new place, which wasn't new anymore. I'd been here maybe 6 or 7 years at that point. And I had a little herb garden. And all of a sudden, I was able to access the profound wisdom and lessons that were available to me that whole time around the experience of failure. And it made me challenge my first impulse of why I came to the garden, which was control. And I realized that I was trying to control the garden, and I was trying to make it what it was in a different time and place. And I was not paying attention to who she is in this time and place, and what she needs in this time and place, and what she has to offer, what the cycles of nature feel like and look like and require in this region, different than the region that I was in before. And furthermore, that every moment of failure, every time a plant would die or it would grow wild but not produce any fruit, that second year after growing that herb garden, I planted 16 different tomato plants all over my property, different places, trying to figure out what's the best place to grow tomatoes. And most of those plants grew beautiful and lush and huge, and all but one failed to set a single tomato fruit. I had to laugh at myself. But I realized that all of those moments of failure it was like a test, right? That I failed the first time when I gave up. It was a test to say, how closely can you pay attention? How curious can you get about the world around you? How much can you surrender the need to control this space and instead rest into collaboration? How closely can you observe what's happening and respond? Choose to respond rather than to stay in the old responses. And as I'm sure you can tell, those were lessons that were valuable not only in growing a garden, but in pretty much every other aspect of life. Where can I be a collaborator with life rather than one who seeks to control every aspect of my life? Where can I begin to release my attachment to the outcomes that I want and that I conceived of and that I wish to be? Where can I lose my need for things to be predictable, for things to unfold in a way that, has specific meaning to me? And the irony is that as I relaxed into that new stance, the cycles, with their somewhat predictability, began to make sense to me in a way that they had never before. The cycles of the garden, the cycles of my relationships, the cycles of my own energy, my own ability to get work done, all of a sudden began to become more clear to me. And I could, when I chose, which was not always, right? Because old habits die hard. So there was still that need to control. But when I chose, I could collaborate with those cycles. And in those moments, the outcomes that I observed were always more satisfying and long lasting and positive ways than those that I was trying to control in the first place. It's a lesson I'm still working on learning. But every time I observe it, it sinks it in a little bit more deeply. Yeah, failure, powerful teacher. Friends, look at how happy these little plants are in this green stalk planter. Just doing their very best here. Looking so good. Look at this lemon basil. It smells delicious. I wish we had smell-o-vision to share that with you. I did a review of this garden planter and another version that I'm trying out, and I'm actually gonna post an update with my conclusions about the two of them pretty soon, but I just wanted to show you how absolutely gorgeous those look. And this little section, this here is that very first herb garden that I just told you about, getting watered. And you can see it is still just thriving and doing really well. So we're ending here back where we began with the beehives. And the final piece of the story that I want to share today, these little vignettes of my answer to the question of why did I come to the garden, I have to say is about resilience. It's about resilience. After that experience of failure over multiple years and giving up and walking away from the garden, and then coming to a place where I really had to experience the grief of that choice, turn back to the garden, back to that part of myself that had been so important for so much of my life that I had just walked away from. And turning towards the humility necessary to try again, right? There was a pretty profound sense of humility that was needed to try again. And in the trying again, from a stance of curiosity, from a stance of humility, from a stance of releasing control and instead turning towards collaboration, I began to grow things again. Grow things in the garden, of course, plants, food, flowers, but also grow things inside, to reconnect to provisions inside of myself that had been packed away, unused for a very long time. And what I found is that one of the most valuable, the most profound of those provisions that I pull out and call on day after day in every part of my life is resilience. That green stalk that we just looked at didn't look like that when I first planted it. I filled that green stalk with flower seeds and then with a handful of seedlings that were not doing well, that had stayed too long in their little seedling pots and had gotten a little bit neglected. And honestly, I had almost given up on. And I was like, well, I have some space in this new green stalk that I want to try out. Why not? Let me toss them in there. Put them in there, planted the seeds. All of that stayed dormant and still for the longest time before it really started to warm up. And I thought, well, that doesn't look like that's going to amount to much. But I'll keep watering it. I'll keep tending it. I'll keep trying. I'll keep collaborating with it. We'll see what happens. And at a certain point, the conditions for those plants shifted. They had what they needed. They had the temperatures they needed. They had the nutrients they needed. They had the regular tending that they needed. And all of a sudden they began to thrive. And it was so exciting. Gardeners, you know what I'm talking about. Or any of us who have, invested our time and our love into something that we weren't sure was going to make it, right? And then it turns around and starts to thrive. And there was such a celebration in that. There was such a that moment at the end of a movie where the hero finally, wins the race or something. And you're just like, yes, you did it, that sense of triumph. Not my own triumph, right? But the triumph of life, the triumph of seeds that are absolutely built to grow. The triumph of persistence, the triumph of the cycles of life. And as difficult as they can be to predict, there's still the predictability that the temperatures are going to warm up. There's still the predictability that plants will begin to set flowers when they have the conditions that they need. And that embodied visceral experience of witnessing resilience here in this space over and over and over again, and getting to be a participant in that resilience, getting to be a partner in that. I now understand is one of the most profound and important reasons why I come to the garden. Because it shows me how much life loves to express itself in all of its fullness. And sometimes the things that I'm doing to try to control that life, try to shape it into a particular mold, sometimes it's those things that hinder the growth the most. Other times, the structures and conditions that I'm putting into place here in this garden greatly benefit that life expressing itself and doing exactly what it's meant to do. So again, that's where those collaborations are happening rather than control. There are probably many, many, many other reasons why I come to the garden. But we're going to save those for another day. And we're going to just rest here on resilience. And I would love to know from you, why do you come to the garden? What has it taught you? What has it shown you? What are those moments when it has defeated you? What did you choose to do in the wake of that defeat? And how did it impact you to make those choices? Sometimes those are hard questions. I felt a lot of shame in that period of time when I had given up on growing a garden, when I'd turned away from it, when I'd made the decision to give up. But in contrast to the feeling of joy of turning back to it, I think I can safely say that I wouldn't have even necessarily given up that experience of grief in that season of my life when I let my garden die. So my wish for you is that you choose curiosity, that you choose collaboration, that you choose to try again, that you choose to partner with life in all of the places that it shows up in your day-to-day, inside of yourself, around you, in your community, and in this world. Because when we're collaborators with the cycles of life, rather than ones who wish to control, ones who wish to subvert, ones who wish to profit without giving anything back. That's when the despair that we sometimes experience from life and that we sometimes witness in the world around us can take hold. So, choose a different path. Choose to turn towards the garden. However the garden shows up in your life, inside of yourself and around yourself. And as you do so, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. I look forward to hearing about it, and I look forward to continuing to share this garden with you. Thanks for being with me. I love you. Till next time.